Hello and welcome back to No Bullshit. Today we return to talking about the long-awaited and much-anticipated Watchmen TV series that recently finally had its premiere on HBO this past weekend. Before we go over the first pilot episode though, and talk about how it's more nuanced and multifaceted than we may have thought, but first, let's recap the series and what led to this show being made. This new TV show is a sequel to the original comic book series from the 1980s, which also was adapted into a film by Zack Snyder in 2009. I personally have always been a huge fan of Watchmen too, but when the new HBO spin-off was announced, I became a little worried to say the least. Not only has HBO been known to be overtly left-wing and political over the years, but also, with the king of cliffhangers and the sultan of bad, confusing endings mounting this thing, none other than the lost and leftover showrunner Damon Lindelof, well, with him in charge, needless to say, we all had multiple worries. In addition, the show also seemed to be pointed at and very keen on attacking white people and calling us all racist and using the usual baseless accusations against us with the kind of offensive vigor we see from Hollywood liberals all the time. Now, of course, that's not to say Watchmen shouldn't be political. In fact, many misinterpreted my first video about this series as implying this shouldn't be political at all, but that's not the case for sure. Watchmen, of course, has always been a political series, and it's always had its left versus right commentaries too, but originally it did seem to be more done in a nuanced, relative, and fair way that played off of both sides. Like, for example, how the original comic rallied against President Nixon, turning the former US president into a long-running, numerous term-having, virtual dictator of America in their story. And not only did Nixon avoid Watergate in the Watchmen universe, but also he won the Vietnam War, and eventually even settled disputes with Russia, which resulted in ratifying a peace treaty with them. And this was all fine and dandy, and some of it justified criticism even. But the way the new show was announced to go against whites and conservatives, it seemed to be out of nowhere, and more based on leftist conjecture and sometimes even their wildest sorts of conspiracy theories and exaggerations about a certain race that's become okay to hate in current year, white people. Yes, the new Watchmen show was originally promoted and is still currently touted as an attack on white supremacy. This is being done by the media and Watchmen's show and promoters itself. And needless to say, it's not a good start for the series, especially for realists like us. Usually and almost always, when lefties bring up bogus notions like this, it's not because there are actually racist whites going around hating on every other race indiscriminately like how they claim. No, actually, when radical leftists bring up so-called white supremacy, that's just their low-key dog whistle of a way to attack white people. And it's a way to say we're all racist and terrible, which in actuality is them being racist against us. So with that said, and keeping in mind that white races aren't even actually relevant problems that need to be addressed in this day and age, well, it really makes you think here. Why would a new show like this that should be political and relevant, well, why would they be addressing this non-issue so much? Especially when there's so many other real issues that could be dealt with here and would be much more interesting. And now, having seen the new show, I'm happy to report the new Watchmen episode does dig into things much more than we anticipated. In fact, I would even say it slams liberals and leftists more than they might have thought themselves. Some might not have noticed it and others might not see it that way at all, but I know I did. And even if you look past some parts and didn't think you saw them, well, just because you didn't notice them doesn't mean your brain didn't. And that's the beauty of art, isn't it? It's always open to interpretation. So even if you view it different than what others think or what the actual artist intended, you can't really be wrong about how you personally see things, especially with art like this. And as we go over things in this new episode's plot, I'm also going to extensively explain the way I see them and how I interpret things, so you too can have your eyes open on this whole Watchmen show. And you also might even have your mind blown while we all sit here and listen and discover what the show is actually about. And before you doubt me and think I'm just pulling this out of my ass as a way to justify my side in a reaching roundabout sort of way, well, first of all, there is still a lot of anti-white bullshit in this show, so let's not get it twisted. I'm not becoming a stand for them, and it's not a great, amazing thing yet either. But also, if you take a look at this article, even this left-wing activist group, the former news channel known as CNN, well, they agree with me in how this show is open to interpretation. This article of theirs says it right in the title. It says, Watchmen HBO series presents its own Rorschach test. And this Rorschach test is not only the inspiration of one of the main characters from the original Watchmen comic, but also a Rorschach test is a real world thing, and it's exactly what I said before. It's open to interpretation. Basically, during this test, doctors show you ink blots and take notes on what you see in them. Then, using your answers to make some sort of psychological assessment, they interpret and see what they can learn and figure out about you, and possibly help you with your problems or issues. And so too is this new show a sort of ink blot test, a Rorschach test, because it offers lots of open-ended themes, plot points, and ideas, and the way you interpret them is all up to you. So with that said, I think going over all this again, you'll see why this show, while it might seem bad, anti-white, and liberal biased, but also at the same time, the very premise of it is based at least somewhat on ambiguity. And also, it shows how there are many sides and things aren't always what they seem. Now, with all that out of the way, let's jump into this episode a bit and discuss some of the main plot points, so you can start to see what I'm talking about. First things first, right from the beginning, the new show starts off with a flashback to 1921. Set in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the very first scenes of this Watchmen series portray a real-world event called the Tulsa Race Massacre. This historic tragedy was all too real back in the day too, and while it might seem a little out of place here, flashing back to 100 years ago to find a striking event where whites killed a bunch of black people because of racism, well, despite that, at the same time, this is actually not as offensive to whites in the present as you might think, at least not to the right whites, the ones you might be thinking they're going against. And that's because, well, these racist whites who killed hundreds of blacks back then, they were actually Southern Democrats and liberals, and descendants of the South who fought to keep their slaves back in the Civil War in the 1860s. And following the South's loss in 1865, those Southern Democrats still wanted to keep the black people down, so they formed even more racist groups who wore those famous white robes and infamously terrorized blacks for generations, like what's happening in this massacre. So while the portrayal of these anti-black racists from 1921 in Tulsa in the Watchmen show might seem like they're an attack on modern conservatives or right-leaning types in the present, really, it's much more closely related to liberals in the present and the Democratic Party, who were the ones carrying out these racist acts back in the day, and they're also racist and anti-black now, if you think about it. And this Tulsa massacre flashback in the show results in a young black boy escaping it and coming back later as an old man for still unknown reasons. Next, the show then cuts to 2019, current year, and we see a black cop with a mask pulling over a white redneck type character in a truck. And here's where we get our first bit of history rewriting too. Obviously, it's supposed to be implied here that those racist whites in the flashback are still around and hating on blacks, like what we see in this current year scene, but really, the truth is, this white redneck guy would more likely be a conservative type, maybe even a Trump supporter, and nothing he actually does here is racist against blacks either. But this kind of false connection with the past is exactly what we've seen many liberals do in the present too, so it's sort of bad for this new show to try and pull it off as well. We all know that the racist anti-black white people were actually liberals back then, and Southern Democrats, and many of them still are too, but lefties naturally resist admitting to their own terrible past, so that's why they try and blame it on other people, and even they pretend the parties flipped at some point and conservatives are now the real racist, when really that's not true. And how convenient of a claim for them. Too convenient actually, and that's because it's completely false. In fact, many would say liberals still try and keep black people under their thumb to this day. That's why they treat them like poor, defenseless, helpless children who aren't responsible for their actions. And that's because left-wingers think black people aren't equal to them. And that's why they treat them like these poor, never-ending victims who can't even help themselves if they tried. Next, we turn to a scene with our new main character, played by Oscar-winning actress Regina King. She is giving a speech about cooking at a local kids' school, when she then starts taking questions afterwards. First, she's asked about where she's from, which happens to be Vietnam, which in this universe became a US state after we won the Vietnam War. Then, a rude boy, who of course is white, he asks Regina if she got the money to start her business from what he and the show called red furations. This angers King and causes a commotion in the classroom too. And if you're not in the know, this requires a bit of explanation to realize what's going on. First of all, the obvious is that red furations is a play on the word reparations, which of course is an idea in our real world too. Reparations are when modern black people ask for payments and benefits for supposedly suffering under racism since their enslavement here in America before that was outlawed in 1865. Fortunately, most reparations already happened a long time ago back then, and modern blacks who ask for them are just obsessed with victimhood, and they think they can get some more free money from the government while they do it. And well, in this Watchmen world, reparations reparations actually did happen, and they're called reparations because they were enacted and given out under the current in-universe US president, Robert Redford. Redford is a fictionalized version of the real-world actor who ends up becoming president in this universe. Much like how Ronald Reagan, another actor in the real world, well, he became our actual president in the real timeline here. In this world, instead of a conservative like Reagan becoming president, it's a stark liberal like Redford, and this is another commentary against them. And with all that said, reparations actually play out in an open to interpretation way here too, because although in this scene they are brought up by a white kid to make him look bad and anti-black and racist, and like another vilified white person, but also, in addition, they can be seen as having the expected negative effect on society that we all talk about when they're brought up in the real world too. As suspected, these reparations make whites and other races resent the black people, who appear to be given free money because the liberal president and government are pandering to them. And this jealousy here is natural and pretty justified too, considering those receiving reparations aren't actually victims of slavery themselves, and usually they didn't even suffer from much racism either. And this kind of resentment is the type of thing that bubbles up and eventually overflows within people over time, and quite possibly it's part of the reason this new Watchmen universe is seeing uprisings among its often offended and ridiculed white population. Not to say their supposed racism and anti-blackness is justified or anything, but who's to say that's the real motivation behind the so-called cavalry, which is what the supposed racist white supremacist group is called in this show, who also end up donning those Rorschach masks you've seen in the previews, inspired by the fallen hero from the original comics. Now, to take that idea one step further, I think if we keep our open interpretation going that way, you could also say that these claims by the show, its main characters and the controlling liberal government, well, them claiming the Rorschach protester types are white supremacists, that could also be seen as just as baseless and biased and propaganda inspired as the claims like this we see in the real world now. I've said this time and time again that that label is basically meaningless these days, and most people being called racist like that aren't actually for that ideology at all. And two, I also believe those that are wearing the Rorschach mask in this show, these white people aren't anti-everyone racist like how others are claiming. That's still to be determined fully, of course, but it would make a lot of sense. And even if it doesn't all play out that way, it's still an interesting way to look at things, especially this early on in the show when it's so accurately reflecting the real world, as we all have seen. Finally, before we go, while this episode has a lot more going on in it, I'm unfortunately not going to have time to deep dive into much more of it. We don't really need to spoil everything here either, since I think you can see my premise and how this whole thing isn't as anti-right wing as you might have thought. Sure, it probably will end up being more so as we go on, and since the writer, creator, and even the main actor, Regina King, they've been known to be starkly liberal and anti-white and anti-conservative too, but at the same time, since the premise of this show is a bit of an open-ended Rorschach test itself, they kinda also inadvertently open themselves up to being interpreted in other less flattering ways. In addition, opening with a scene of Southern Democrats slaughtering blacks in Tulsa wasn't necessarily the best look for the left-wingers here, even though I'm pretty sure they don't see it that way at all. But hey, I'm just going by history here, and I'm just using facts. And I'm also turning their story and its premise against them, as we should, because a lot of their own claims and interpretations, they're just plain wrong. Lastly, before we go, there is a few other things worth mentioning in this episode. One scene in particular shows the cavalry's leader wearing a Rorschach mask, of course, and he's also giving a speech to the public about getting rid of the world's accumulated black filth and making liberal tears run through the streets, and even calling some people race traitors. This, of course, can be seen as highly racist and offensive, but also it's a result of radical liberal policies and leftists taking over and shunning whites for generations here. This is true in the real world, and also it's even worse in the Watchmen world, since they've gotten even more terrible under a liberal president like Robert Redford, who's even gone so far as to give reparations to black people to pander to them. So with all that said, it's not to say racism is good or even justified here, but their cause certainly has some backing to it, and it's not coming out of the blue either. What do you guys think? Did you watch this Watchmen premiere episode? Do you think the show will end up being open-ended and open into interpretation like the Rorschach test and like how we suspected? Comment your thoughts on everything below, and thanks for watching No Bullshit. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and we'll see y'all next time.